what we're going to present is a chapter from the book that Jeff mentioned, Bleak Joys. The subtitle is Aesthetics of Ecology and Impossibility. And it's a book that looks at a number of ways in which there's a kind of movement between ecological thinking in the present, which has to be a thinking about bad ecologies, ecologies going wrong, and thinking about their aesthetic dimension, that is how they involve sensing and sense-making as a form of aesthetics. And on the other hand, how those are enmeshed with systems of control, or systems of forms of control that go awry or produce their own kind of dynamic structures as they go wrong. It won't take you too much to kind of ponder on, to look at the present. This book is a kind of set of remarks on the present world in some ways. The kind of parallels will be relatively obvious as we begin to discuss this. But other chapters alongside this one on irresolvability are around plants, the idea of home, and kind of home as a kind of difficult place in contemporary cultural theory, on devastation, so thinking about devastation as a form of becoming, and some other things that kind of move between analysis of aesthetics in relationship to ecology and aesthetics in relationship to systems of control, both looked at through a kind of dark lens, in a sense.
So the genesis of the book really is that it's about things that which is discussed in life. It's not born out of like a need to publish. And we were writing these separate chapters for quite a while, for this weird fun. And then it appeared that it actually could be brought together as a book. And in a way, the way it was generated was the desire to in kind of engage with thinking about very difficult and bad things. And at the moment, we started writing a long time ago, so at the moment it's really obvious that things are really bad. But at that time when we started writing it, there was still a sense of optimism, a certain kind of Protestant optimism in Anglo-Saxon world, and we were trying to find a language and tackle problems that are not obviously either good or bad, but that are kind of maintained across different scales and different kinds of things, maintained in the sense of kind of being quite bad, but not completely awful, but not actually good, and this kind of sense of being stuck in on a scale of between like something really positive and complete catastrophe is the sense we're trying to capture in this book. And this chapter in a way is key to a certain form of power that makes things dwell in this boundary kind of irresolvable condition. So we will actually read, which I'll try to make entertaining facial movements, but just hopefully it will be clear. So Christa Wolf is a German writer, East German writer. She wrote, what made Stone Age people or primitive farmers unhappy was different in kind from the misfortunes of modern men and women. There's no way they could have felt the terrible demands of conscience we feel when we see that we cannot avoid making a decision, but that none of our choices is the right one. Here she poses the condition of choice on an earth lit unbearably clearly, not with the optimism of Hegel's spirit, but by a now radioactive sunburst, which in one flash illuminates the features of the new world. In this flesh-charring light, the state of irresolvability is that of a conflict mapped out by other people's brains, other larval mentalities, and amongst them the emergent electronic ones. So this condition of irresolvability, which arises when, as Christa Wolf says, We cannot avoid making a decision, but none of our choices is the right one, is worth looking at because there's something about the present that seems to generalize this condition, rather than solely acted out at the scale of states, of weapon systems and of strategy, or indeed at the level of choice per se. In such a condition, choice is hypothesized as actually possible, where the choice is actually conceivable as rational, bounded, linked to a conscious subject, is left as an implementation detail. Indeed, choice as a transcendental that persists despite the lack of agents actually able to exemplify or address it is a fundamental characteristic of political theories that attempt to establish its freedom, where freedom of choice means the increased autonomy of choice from any agent capable of making it. Interwoven with such a condition, there is an increased intractability of the world for those whom ostensibly as humans comply with the definition of sense-making agents. So in this talk we argue that irresolvability has become a fundamental means of structuring life in the present. Such a consistency of a formation of the world in which things cannot be unified but are sustained as systemically irresolvable is a mode of operation of power that calculates devastations and besieges anguish unless it can be usefully employed in the maintenance of non-decidability. One of the ways into the question of our irresolvability is by working through some of the technical, philosophical, and cultural conditions and precursors of the misfortune that Wolff wrote about. There is also the question of how this condition developed from the time in which he wrote.
Okay, so what we want to discuss in relationship to irresolvability is something that moves across the scales of subjects and of states. Irresolvability is the structural incapacity to sort out a problem, uneasiness, being in a state of inhabiting a problem that both consists of you and that is out with you. It's a means of establishing a certain kind of economy of deterrence, dysfunction, a generalised condition of sludginess. Irresolvability names the condition in which the structuring incapacity of action of the Cold War becomes, by means of related technologies, the economic and organisational forms and processes of subjectivation, a part of everyday infrastructures of feeling. By infrastructures of feeling, what we mean is that in the work of Raymond Williams, where structures of feeling are to do with the locale and the activation of place as culture, infrastructures of feeling are established by medial and strategic forms that integrate spaces as conjoint conditions of possibility. The Cold War is one of these, climate damage is another. As an analysis of these conditions, this talk proposes that there's a genealogy to be drawn between following the game theory of the 1940s and 50s and its relationship to the Cold War, and the state of intractability Wolff describes, the theories of self-organisation of the 1960s, that is second-order cybernetics, and the great interest in them taken by Friedrich Hayek, amongst others, which is specifically articulated in his figure of the ideal market that he calls a catalaxy, and the development of irresolvability as an ostensibly emergent and multi-scalar quality of contemporary life once those theories have been more or less ineptly operationalized, even if only ideationally, as players in economic and subjectival life.
So Wolff regards the misfortunes of modern men and women as partially a side effect of the Cold War, whose mentalities were probed, conjured, and installed by numerous means of varying degrees of abstraction. It is this relation between modalities of abstract structuration in strategic logics and idealization of social economic forms, and worldly events ranging from the subjectival to the global or cosmic, and the consequent means of divining and inaugurating the possible and the impossible that we are after. To trace one side of the infrastructure feeling of the Cold War, one can examine the Manhattan Project an advanced example of the communization of intellect towards the generation of new kinds of weapons, the first atomic bombs. The Manhattan Project was a space marked by the interrelation of highly novel and arcane mathematical and physical calculation, coupled with the arrangement of materials, instruments, equipment, metals of greater and lesser degrees of refinement, including expanding this network to the Shinkilobe mine in Congo, and the space whose ligaments spread to various parts of the world and which were fed by fleeing Europeans and exuberant budgets. A space set in the sprawling landscape of North American military bases, university campuses, and in those of atomic particles. This scalar exuberance is found too in the calculation of the activity of atoms in a state of great expansion, coupled with the basic violent gesture of dropping a lump of something heavy onto someone else. What followed in Hiroshima and Nagasaki was a disaster, and what followed in terms of perpetual strategic foreplay and massification was also the attempt to map and articulate the consequences of such a disaster, to ramify it as a condition of an irremovable possibility of indiscriminate annihilation, out of which there is no way and outside of which it is impossible to think. So Wolf in particular talks about the invention of and the development of the atomic bomb as this beginning of a condition of the irremovable possibility of indiscriminate annihilation in which we now have to inhabit, and there's no way out of it. In this newly global infrastructure of feeling, some of the same mathematicians that were involved in the project of the atomic bomb came to the fore in marking out this terrain, using variation on work that had been generated beforehand.
Oscar Morgenstern and John von Neumann's theory of games and economic behaviour is a founding text of game theory. It's a magnificent attempt to stabilise events, to understand them, but also to make action on them intractable by means of mathematical logic. It's an attempt to make reality yield by giving it instructions, by laying out its secret laws that until then it had never known it had, and to possess them, to seduce them so that the rigour of the secret paths of strategy become intimately known in a way that convinces themselves that they exist. The book itself became part of a much larger assemblage of which it was something of a sublimated keystone, never much revisited in von Neumann's own work, and which grew out to include military technologies, research organisations, and what can be said to be a rhetorical and subjectival infrastructure of threat, opportunity, counter-threat, and a calculus more generally of a governance of choice. This was a structure of feeling localised within the pages of a book, which had the novelty of implying subjectivation with strategic importance, but also of a governance that in turns implies subjects who make that choice and the ruling apparatus in which they do so. It was also, we propose, a preliminary manual for the establishment of irresolvability in disturbed conditions, a device to register the world both in terms of a transparency in information and to orient in the state of their unachievability. The book emphasises strategic thinking as a basic principle of interaction between entities in the world, one based on asymmetric competition and collaboration with absolute conditions of winning and losing, what are called zero-sum games, being highly emphasised, even if only as a fantasy that keeps the game in motion. A little later, other formulations, such as the celebrated Nash equilibrium, also came into circulation as modes of metastability in which no absolute victory need take place. And this slide shows the famous prisoner's dilemma model in game theory, where it shows the top left model is the Nash equilibrium outcome, where both
Tell the history of it.
yeah. So the prisoner's dilemma is a story where you have
Alex and Bob.
yeah. So you have two characters, Alex and Bob.
In this,
They're both locked up in. They both committed a crime, and the police are trying to get them to admit to the crime. And if they both stay quiet, the police don't know anything, they can't prove anything, so they both get out. If they both grass each other up, they'll both go down. But if only one of them talks, then you get the 3-year result. And this is
So it's like decision structures. They are locked in different cells, and they have to decide what to do, each of them individually. And these are the 4 options that are available to them. And this is how game theory operates, right?
Yeah.
So then the Nash equilibrium is the one in top left corner, which is the less optimal, but is not the best. And
So the optimal one is they both go free in the bottom right. The top left is the kind of mediocre, middling one. And this was what the Cold War was designed through von Neumann's strategic thinking, was to produce this kind of result. So John Nash was the person who the film A Beautiful Mind was made about, mathematician, very, very interesting character. But he was the one who kind of strategically designed this approach of non-optimal outcome for the Cold War. So a little later, other formulations, such as the celebrated Nash equilibrium, also came into circulation as models of metastability in which no absolute victory need take place. The contours of irresolvability in the Cold War are sketched in these documents and developed further in texts such as Thomas Schelling's The Strategy of Conflict. Schelling was the theorist of shock and awe, one of the theorists who kind of laid the grounds for what became later shock and awe, as used in the Iraq War. But he was one of the key theorists from the 60s to the 80s of strategic game thinking, game theory. So Thomas Schelling's book, The Strategy of Conflict, argues in chipper and concise language a way to map the terrain of deterrence, a means of positively affirming irresolvability as an end. So game theory was only one of the mechanisms for choice developed during the Cold War period, in which a multitude of agendas, opportunisms, interesting leads, and seams of possibility for the elaboration of a certain modality of superiority were mobilized in order to explore the phase space of power at that historical moment. And this was a historical moment in which mathematical, electronic, logistical, and other formulations came into being in competition and interdisciplinary interaction with each other. Saturated in cash from military largesse, such competition was displaced from being merely economic. Given this state of abundance, there was a necessity of mobilization. Others were to be enrolled in strategies of conflict, become part of the strategic wager. These were members of populations who are arranged as targets or as actors, whose processing of the situation corresponds to some model of interest, some formula of rationality or non-rationality. One way of handling irresolvability is to enroll more actors, other factors, to spread the circuit and the distribution of probabilities, but also to extend these across the surface of the planet and through time. At the same moment, across and beneath the surface, Krasnogorsky mine in the Kazakhstan of the USSR starts to disgorge its uranium in complement to the source of the substances commanded by those who describe themselves the leaders of the curiously named free world. At the same time, this process further ends the predictability of monopolies.
So history comes to a halt if or when the atomic weapons are used, but it also starts to feed into and corral the passage of time. In turn, other actors, Britain, France, China, India, Pakistan, Israel, North Korea, Iran, and the regional proxies of the countries affecting to project themselves as superpowers and thus accede to nuclear protection, descend and fractalize the generalized game of chicken, as Bertrand Russell described the arms race. This game is in turn rendered more quotidian, factored into models, and becomes a new norm, against which further acts of chicken or brinksmanship can be played out. The Non-Proliferation Treaty, the International Atomic Energy Authority, and their apparatus create further conditions in which things stabilize and are rendered as appearing to do so. The phantasmagoria of weapons of mass destruction in Iraq culminated in their use as a pretext for invasion in 2003. At the same time, technical game changers or disruptive technologies, such as the introduction of the hydrogen bomb, ICBMs, and the Star Wars, attempt to shift or displace the axis of tension. Deterrence, then, is how those who deploy this strategy explain it to themselves as they generate all this infrastructure, and irresolvability is how it is experienced by those they enroll. Christa Wolff's figuration of the generalization of wrong choices, one of which must be necessarily taken, has potential affinities with some of the central questions in the history of thought, like some posed by Sartre or Kierkegaard. But Wolff nods towards a condition that diverges from the one they map. In that choice is now often inhabited by cybernetic operators, choice structures that provide an architecture of decision that protect against the anxiety of being. This change is a distinct shift. Choice moves from being the result of tradition, underwritten by belief systems or customs such as religion, to being in the modern world an awful imperative to confront one's own fate where there is no longer any moral armature. This emptiness, which is at the same time a certain image of freedom, is subsequently populated by logical models that provide convenient rails or recommendations for thoughts to run along. So I found this slide to illustrate that. The condition of finding oneself raised under the rule of two contradictory but inevitable imperatives, you must make the right decision, none of the decisions you can make is the right one, is typical of a condition that, for Gregory Bateson, produces schizophrenia, the double bind, a form of paradox. Bateson set his argument out in relation to the condition of the family, specifically a configuration of the mother and child relation. So I have a picture of Bateson with his daughter, Mary. But it has a more general applicability, and he later provides evidence for its cruel experimental inducement in dolphins, which may, in Bateson's words, promote creativity, when this is encoded as novel behaviors, such as those a starved and confused dolphin may untypically make when trying to work out what will induce a previously generous trainer to stop depriving them of food. In this model, schizophrenia is incurred when a being is in a double bind, yet denied the metacommunicative layer, the ability to communicate about communication, to theorize. The problem with being on the receiving end of deterrence is that it implies being forced to rationalize under conditions of absolute fear of nuclear annihilation as the grounding basis of reason. The metacommunicative layer is there and measured by the kiloton. Game theory is rooted in part in attempt to abstract out from this layer into one of strategic universality.
Okay, and then we're going to move into a section where we look at how the same kind of tools that set up the theory of deterrence in the Cold War then move into a theorization of other kinds of structure within societies. Particularly, we're interested in markets. Philip Murawski assembles a profoundly argued history of economic modelling, policy, and their multifarious genealogy in his book, Machine Dreams, Economics Becomes a Cyborg Science. This is a virtuoso mapping of the transition of logical formalisms gestated in game theory and related domains of mathematical description and formalization into active economic modelling and organising forces, where the metaphor of the computer is projected onto economic conditions and modes of knowledge. This projection is not, of course, coherent, full of self-consistent, but something that creates conditions of what, in Gilles Deleuze's reading of the work of Michel Foucault, is described as the deep, anonymous murmur of society, and in which the self tendentially coincides with circulating logics. Such projections are not merely statements, but actions. Instead of using linguistics as a model, such logics rely on the unfolding of material forces in programs and on processing the projections of possibility. Projections of logics operate as structured anticipations of possibility, but also as kinetic extensions of force and articulation. Such anticipations are produced in formulae that address actual or possible actors, varying scales of possible actions, and the projections that those in turn entail and corroborate. In this arrangement, the functions of subject, object, and concept contain derivatives. These derivatives can, of course, be speculated upon, subject to interpretation. Ghosts may form amongst them in the mutual overlaying of projections, interpretations, and speculations upon the articulation of these. Such ghosts and possibilities of them gain traction on the present and preempt futures. Ghosts are a useful frame for these murmuring entities, attractors in the shifting phase spaces of possibilities, since, in the mode of the Cold War, they are the accumulated traces of the projected dead acting back onto the present. But they take other forms, become new objects that move as lugubrious statistical ectoplasm. Irresolvability is not the result of work of a specific class of strategists unfolding a plan and a techne to have it implemented. Neither is it simply a social order of silent compulsion embedded in words and things. Irresolvability is a coming into being of arrangements that hinder, hamper, render difficult or obscure the prospects of the capacity to imagine a way beyond a particular impasse.
Considering the 21st century, this voice of austerity as it speaks to the young people more widely. Your life has been pre-lived by the money that came before you, the becoming of the negative imprint which you must endure through the duress of your life as your debt. One of the forms and conditions in which irresolvability occurs is economic, where, for instance, it may, within a certain vocabulary, manifest as stagnation. But irresolvability is also more crawlingly lively and dynamic. In work that maps this condition, it is understood that decision and threat come not solely from large aggregate monopolies of power, but also from micro-scale actors and the imagination of them. There is a continuity here with the discussions of the need to stabilize the sincerity of negotiators in the Cold War against the tendency of their equipment to become independently active, to start to generate false positives and to trigger alerts. The decentralization of command and control established from the 50s onwards in order to avoid the effects of an attack on a central command position generates an exponential capacity for error and the effects of unintended consequences. In a disturbing sense, the fear of small numbers, promulgated by the interplay between securitization and terror, is a generalization or democratization of the condition of distributing the capacity to launch nuclear weapons to low-ranking and geographically dispersed officers. Irresolvability is in part a democratization of the strategic logics of the Cold War, so that it provides the logic for relationship on any scale as part of the infrastructure of feeling.
Cybernetic vocabularies of abstract dynamics, paralleling and interweaving with the world of game theory, also suggested some anti-systemic strategies. The policy, or bluff, of the mutually assured destruction, based around a dodging of the constraints of rationality, which also established the lure of going well beyond them. This approach, as is well known, was promulgated by Richard Nixon, the man who introduced relativism as a basic factor in Western rule through the abolition of the gold standard and engaged in devoted self-monitoring and the tape recording of all phones as a means of correlating the self to magnetic tape. As soon as game theory became a scaffold by which events and evaluations were systematized, it also gained its means of being gamed, despite its extensive rigour. Being gamed meant being resolved or broken by the dramatic gesture, or having its logic outreckoned by the imperatives and movements of hidden factors. Technocratic politics is vulnerable to outmaneuver by maniacal exuberance. The durational game of irresolvability itself emerges in the interplay of these factors as the flaw that undermines logic, allowing in turn for its perpetuation. Such questions drive game theory's convergence with evolutionary models and in turn the shift from probability to possibility, the move from the modelling of likelihood to unlikelihood as the zone that must be sought out and mastered. Equally, we move from a state of power over populations based on probabilistic calculation to one based on the composition of variables where people are acted on via those variables and where the variables themselves become directly operated on by people as their tokens of interaction that in turn become motions of indifference. It is crucial to recognise that we do not describe one particular systematization of economic, social or cognitive life that came to fully dominate and thus depleted or actually overpopulated the spaces and conditions of possibility, saturating it with modalities of interaction of a specific kind, loyal to a particular notion of formalism. What is more opportune to trace is the possibility that the multiplication of very diverse conditions and scales in which things become irresolvable has to do with the cognitive conditions of decision making in infrastructures of feeling and in turn the positing of a particular set of idealizations of formalisms as well as the very material device-like nature in which they become manifest.
Another key work of John von Neumann that has relevance here is his work on automata. These are key means for decision-making formalizations to migrate into more widespread and more marginal forms of life, to become a form of life in themselves, and to become more multiscalar in form. As institutions in the economic sense can, with greater or lesser degrees of interference, be abstracted to sets of instructions, so too can they be produced in programmatic and automatic form. Indeed, given the difficulty of noise in information systems, as Claude Shannon put it, one of the more attractive features of von Neumann's work in automata was the idea of making reliable machines out of unreliable components. This might mean creating an economic and interpersonal logic that what passes for rationality within it would be so readily obvious to all participants due to its transparency that all concerned would voluntarily acquiesce to its operation, independent of their own personal or collective predilections and interests. It is not that these theoretical objects or logics became fully hypostasized, and then imposed on reality to the point that we can no longer see them. Other kinds of restructuring have certainly been made: privatizations, fictional internal markets, criminalization of the activities of trade unions, political activists, and all those lumbered with the euphemism of citizen, systems of interest, consolidation and implementation of patterns of ownership, increasing moves to finalization as a fulcrum of the economy, a generalization of the equipment and techniques of managerialism, and so on and so forth. What occurs is that by these means and others, there's a folding in of certain formalizations into the flesh of life. That means they operate as its almost incipient syntax, as an organizational unconscious. There is no success of these models, no triumph of the formalism. Thousands of them die by the waysides almost as they are offered up as models. Others linger on in half-lives of fading schemata and axioms, but they remain the partial, tendential waterlogging of life with their molecular regime. Such ghosts populate the self-organized political voids that accompany and mirror devastations, generating a wealth of anguish, so that only few other modalities of going forward can elbow in, if we are lucky.
Part of the significance of models such as the market automata of von Neumann is that they're at least nominally capable of sophisticated levels of computation, tending towards a certain kind of completeness in modelling market actions. An important criterion for the success of such models is that they have sufficient requisite variety, this is a term from Ashby's Introduction to Cybernetics, sufficient requisite variety to capture, that is to describe, provide scaffolding for, and thus work into those aspects of life that are beyond the ken of static formalisms. Here, the question of self-organisation and the kinds of second-order cybernetics that implied a high level of reflexivity and flexibility in its experimental models is worth turning to, as in the following section of the relevant work of Friedrich von Hayek. Mirowski notes that Hayek was not among the number of those political economists that attempted a direct implementation of mathematical formalisms into economic forms, but rather that he was someone who promulgated a sense of such forms as necessarily being distributed and non-linear arrangements. The market, always in an ideal form, is deemed by Hayek and others to be the most efficient processor of information regarding price. Price, in turn, is argued to be the best measure and means of communicating the value of something in full across all modalities of value. It is something abstract enough to capture or provide a medium for the articulation and transmission of even unintended consequences. Such use of price is important because it deems it an informational mechanism in which the computing of value is carried out in a distributed and emergent way. At the same time, Hayek also dallied with a liberal form of humanism,
thinking that cognition was somewhat beyond the competence to complete formalization. Okay?
Yeah, sorry.
Yeah.
In 1961, Hayek attended a conference on self-organizing systems. Later, in a major work, though one not always referred to by historians of neoliberalism, he explicitly proposes a model of the market as a self-organizing system in law, legislation, and liberty. This is a book that sets out Hayek's figure of catalaxy. The term is revived by Ludwig von Mises as well, and it's a term that Hayek proposes from the Greek katalatein, meaning for both Hayek and Mises to trade or exchange, but also to bring into a community. Perhaps conversion would be a better term. So this double meaning of trading and communication and being a community mediated via price in a self-organizing manner is what Hayek is interested in with the catalaxy. Much of the book is a framework for policy and does not have a particularly philosophical dimension, rather being a set of prescriptions for the role and limits of government, some of which have become grindingly familiar to those of us that inhabit the world after 1979, the book's year of publication. Since Margaret Thatcher held up a copy of Hayek's The Constitution of Liberty and stated, "This is what we believe," and since the incorporation of the parties of the centre-left into that we, there is little to note but the various toings and froings of the implementation of the programme described within it. One thing does not yet appear so familiar is that the radically post-national nature of the Great Society proposed by Hayek in this book. Another is Hayek's proposition for a fully self-organised market. The idea of catalaxy appears in the second part of the book. It follows a sustained attack on the concept of social justice as a mirage, an argument that it makes on the basis of principle rather than evidence. And such justice remains, however, a submerged concept that subtends the idea of catalaxy by proposing a form of indirect collective action through the medium of the market, one that would emerge without contamination by notions such as solidarity.
In this book, the catalaxy is proposed as the spontaneous, peaceful order that is both pluralistic and freed from the end implied by a hierarchy. A state derived from the full realization of the well-operating market that self-organizes to arrange the pricing and availability of all things within the law of property, contract and tort. Competition is a discovery procedure that is also preeminent in aligning the individual with the development of their highest capacities by being kept on tiptoe, being thus both a moral and epistemic mechanism. The economic form of the game of catallaxy becomes the best that can be contingently attained rather than being perfect. The games of catallaxy results in a society as a meta-level operation of everyone maximizing their utility through the exuberant search for the greatest margin worked out through the development of a system of markets, or of the market as a system of information circulation that is most effective in establishing a price. Indeed, one apotheosis of catallaxy is the algorithmic manifestation in the contemporary management of financial trading, with all the gradients of ascent and descent that this phenomenon affords the humans that are appended to it as an externality and energy source. More widely, as with related writers, the question for Hayek is one of establishing a procedural state rather than an end state. We must not, however, mistake this model or proposition for the grounding of it as actually existing market. Nevertheless, each self-organizing system has its own particular consistency, depending on its constitution. In the terms of von Neumann's automata, much of this quality depends on the degree of the complexity of the computation that it is able to accomplish. But such consistency is also established by any of the characteristics of the material forms from which the system is composed and the terms in which it self-organizes. Hayek is interested in the social orders that form as the result of unintended consequences of human actions. The market as a media for trading value, where an externality is the efficient maximization of human self-interest. The market is a meta-communicative frame for second-order communication about the nature of those desires. One of the virtuous results of such a condition is that it induces actors within the market to rationalize their wants. A general degree of rationality is not a feature of economic theory per se, but rather a result of the processes through which societies, gifted with rationally thinking individuals, will tend to create the conditions in which it is advantageous to think rationally, thus encouraging the germination and development of the spirit of free enterprise. Already we find here the way in which the structure of an idealized market acts as part of a process of subjectivation. In their work, Pierre Dardot and Christian Laval drawn Foucault to show that the neoliberal project is a mode of governance achieved through liberty, by the establishment in various modes of certain kind of subjectivation, the production of individual subjects, and a grammar of interactions. Such individuals will be properly deterred from actions that do not result in the proper realization of value. And so irresolvability is the systemic feedback of what writer Lars Eier calls the normalization of opportunism and cynicism.
What needs to be added, however, is the recognition that just as human desires are ordered, become rational and are met through their ordering in a catallaxy, which never fully arrives, so also do other things that are not so neatly described. Affects are indeed triggered and entrained by such a system that must itself evolve rather than simply be achieved. At the same time, there is a concomitant catallaxy of inopportunity, of inertia, ordering itself around the first-order catallaxy of the market. What are those things that as a result are deemed to be valueless? What are those things that cannot be rationally ordered into a preference list? How do they compose a convex mirror image of the self-organization of non-entities around the all-too-tangible sizzling of the ideal of the autocatalytic market? These suburbs of ghost towns are where value becomes tangled with the stalling of value, with what is precluded from happening by the incipient logics of that which self-organizes, and from which everything else is a residuum. In catallaxy, as an infrastructure of feeling, the sense of irresolvability is simply something to be managed, curtailed, medicated and endured at a local level by individuals. They are turned back into themselves, locked into their place as generators, agents and consumers of irresolvability. What is new here is that irresolvability has been brought to the level of a fundamental axiomatic in social forms and is deeply linked as modus operandi to the mechanisms of devastation represented by game theory's integration into the nuclear infrastructure. The condition of impossibility, the strategic trading of annihilation that was and continues to be so blithely and confidently strategized, may now also be seen as a non-linearly organized condition of emergent deterrence of forms of individuation that do not readily align with the ecological conditions that determine or entrain them. We can say that economic markets and systems built to impersonate them may only capture a small set of fragments of the behavioral and data analytics signature of their extensive subjects. Indeed, just as a drone may misconstrue its target, so too might the mechanism for the entrainment of individuals and the organisation of value. The frustration, acquiescence and rage that accompany this condition are yet to be adequately recognised. Equally, the way in which systematic dumping and pollution have underwritten the economic takeoff of a model that only recognises the automatisms of the market as the form of life proper to growth means that its inverse, in devastations, in anguish, is currently rendered insensible. Okay, thank you.